One of the questions that I ask is a simple question is, how do you want to show up as a leader? When I start to ask that question and people start to consider themselves, again, thinking about that self-awareness, part of what happens is we start to have a conversation around vulnerability and recognizing that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's actually a strength. For me, it's one of the attributes that I think going forward that a leader can start to work on and becoming more vulnerable themselves with their people, which then creates, the ability for us to connect with other people and our team. And we become and increase the level of engagement with our team members by just being able to have a conversation around asking a simple question like, how are you doing? How is everything going? And starting to understand where that person is in their life so we can start to meet them at that point and figure out what is it that we need to do as an organization to care for our people. Again, because our people they're our greatest asset in any organization.
Welcome to the Senior Housing Investors Podcast. If you are an owner, operator, investor, developer, or buyer of senior housing, you've come to the right place. The best way to stay connected with us is to sign up for our weekly newsletter at havensenior.investments.com. This podcast doesn't exist without you, our community. Thank you for listening, and reach out to us anytime. Welcome back, everyone, to a special episode. Today, we sit down with Tom Johnson with Talent Optimizer. Tom helps senior housing organizations hire, retain, and engage the right employees so they can better serve modern elders and increase earnings. Let's listen in.
Thanks, John. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Tom Johnston. Tom's the founder of Talent Optimizer Group, an organization within the wellness and senior living space to help hire, retain, engage the right employees. And I know right now that's extremely timely so that they can better serve modern elders and increase earnings. Two noble goals. Tom is also an executive consultant and coach with over 30 years of proven success. And in full disclosure, Tom has been my leadership coach for a while now, and I can vouch for him personally. Great stuff. And Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey, I'm really excited about the conversation today because I know we had we've had many conversations, but we're in sync in a lot of ways as to how we approach people and management and, the various components and complexities of human resources. You describe your approach with Talent Optimizer Group as a combination of high tech and high touch. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the company? And then also, what does that mean?
So my company is Talent Optimizer Group. And what we're about is really helping organizations to identify the right people for the right role at the right time. And when we talk about talent optimization, it's a discipline. And the discipline of talent optimization is aligning your business strategy with your people strategy. And what I know from my past experience is oftentimes there's a business strategy, John, but there's not necessarily a people strategy. And so when we start to look at the people strategy of an organization, yes, it begins with part of the hiring process and using the tools that I use, which are the high-tech tools, which is really it's a platform. It's a software platform that I use, that I was introduced to about a year and a half ago, and it's called Predictive Index. And we begin with a behavioral assessment where we're able to help folks in a very, very simple way. In a less than 6 minutes, we're able to have an individual take an assessment that is pretty spot on. It's uncanny how much information we're able to gather about ourselves and create that self-awareness. And once we begin to do that, we were able to start to then identify the right person for the right role, because what we do is using the platform, we create something called the job target. So the job target helps us to then identify what type of behaviors we're searching for that are going to have maybe the highest likelihood of being successful in a particular role. And I always say that this becomes another data point. And by using this tool, I help organizations understand is that we're hiring for an individual. We're going to hire for the head, the heart, and the briefcase. And we think of the briefcase, or maybe it's the backpack today, where you have your experience and your resume. And that certainly is important, your credentials. And the heart is your core values. Are we aligned from a core value perspective? And then the head becomes the behavioral assessment that we're able to use. So we're really hiring the whole person.
What's interesting to me is utilizing these types of tools to create a people strategy. I mean, the dinosaur approach to business is, hey, we pay you a salary, we have these benefits, let's go. And the predictive index is fascinating to me. Can you elaborate just a little bit on what that tool does and what exactly is that measuring?
What it's measuring our needs and our behaviors as a result of our needs, and what's really going to motivate us and drive us, and really our natural instincts and our natural behaviors. And it really measures who we are from a behavioral perspective. And again, then when we understand that individual, and what's really important here, John, is that through the use of this tool, the individual is beginning to understand ourselves, right? We create self-awareness with this tool. And we're able to identify our strengths and own those strengths, and potentially even some of our blind spots. And we're able to just have a greater sense of self-awareness. And then when we start to share that information with each other, and this is maybe where that, kind of going back to that high touch piece, is when we start to share that information and we begin to have that self-awareness, we become a little bit more vulnerable with each other and make deeper connections on a human level.
Having taken the predictive index and discussed my results with you, one of the things that was illuminating to me is how I respond under stress. And even though I've taken a number of these types of assessments, this was very different. It's the same material, but it's packaged in a much more digestible way. And for me, I was able to take what I learned about myself and apply it not only to my business life, but also to my personal life. And I don't know if that's something that's common, but understanding myself and how I work under different situations with coworkers, that same knowledge is extraordinarily valuable to me in my personal life. So it seems like taking an organization through this kind of assessment is almost giving them an additional benefit for the employees, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what we're talking about is with self-awareness, we also begin to start to talk about personal and professional development and growth. And that's what people are looking for today. And the workforce of today is looking to align themselves with an organization that's going to help them to grow as an individual. And certainly utilizing these tools is going to do just that if we use them effectively and we use them properly. The higher piece is one of the elements of what we call the talent optimization. The other piece is that we design teams. So we're able to plot the individuals into the software, and then we begin to understand not only ourselves as a leader, but then we start to understand our team. And when we start to understand our team, the effects of this begin to multiply exponentially. And I often tell leaders when we start to use the platform, it's like Moneyball for HR. And we start to really design our teams effectively and know then how we're interacting with each other and potentially where the strengths of that team are, where they lie, and also where as I shared, the blind spots. And then we're able to make recommendations to an organization as to changes they can make pretty quickly and steps that they can take to improve the team dynamics and start to work on the culture of the organization.
It's interesting because I hear the term people strategy, and it sounds like this nebulous gas that's floating out in the ether. And when you boil it down and you gather this data and you have kind of this map of the team, how do you go from there to developing a people strategy? Is it simply making sure you have the right people on the right seats on the bus?
Yeah, part of it, when we think about people strategy, one of the things to understand is that, as I shared, like less than 25% of organizations actually have a people strategy. So we have a business strategy, but when we look at our organization and we look at our most valuable asset in any organization is our people. And so the question then becomes, what is our people strategy? And there's several elements to that. And yes, it begins with getting that right person in the right seat. Absolutely is about designing the right team. And then how do we inspire those people when they enter into the organization? And then how do we also engage folks? And, then we start to look at, again, from a data perspective, is understanding our employee sentiments and how they're feeling about the organization through employee surveys and things like the employee net promoter score, so we can begin to benchmark our culture. And we've got data that we can look at. And then from a people strategy perspective, we're understanding where our gaps are. Well, oftentimes, there's a disconnect between what employers are thinking and feeling and what the employees thinking and feeling. And so we really need to do an assessment of the organization through surveys is one of the most effective ways to do that. Then figuring out what action steps we need to take to improve.
This is actionable intelligence you're gathering. So it's not just the illumination of how individuals work within a team or a group. It's understanding and then putting a plan in place that optimizes everyone's strengths, acknowledges maybe some of the weaknesses or opportunities for growth. But when the whole team is operating with that kind of knowledge, it really does change the chemistry of the company, doesn't it?
It does. And part of what we're talking about here, John, is, in my experience in roles that I've had in the past is, whether it be COO, vice president of sales, my job, I always felt like my job was to set people up for success. And when we start to utilize these tools, we begin to set people up for success. What we want to do by setting people up with the right role is to provide them with engaging work, right, and meaningful work. But also then, in terms of setting them up for success, it's that they're going to enjoy the work that they do every single day. And if we're able to do that, then, our engagement is going to increase. And what does that mean for our residents? What it means is that they're going to potentially be more engaged, if you will. And the whole staff and the culture is going to be about engagement and serving other people because we're enjoying what we're doing every day.
So, Tom, right now, the entire industry, senior living, is really dealing with the labor shortage that's affecting, the entire country. But specifically for caregivers, what we're seeing are a lot of folks that worked through the pandemic that basically burnt out. And they're really good employees that are leaving, seeking other careers because this one was just too stressful. So one of the things you do is assist companies in recruitment and retention of existing employees. How do you go about doing something like that in the midst of this crisis where people are prone to, jump ship for an extra buck an hour?
Look, this has been an extraordinary time for us, and frontline caregivers they've done a phenomenal job. In some instances, they're putting their life on the line, which is noble. There's a lot to unpack there, John. And when we think about money, right, money is important. People will leave for money, but the likelihood of people leaving for money, if in fact they feel valued by the organization, they feel valued by their manager, and they have a sense of belonging within the organization and aligned with that sense of purpose, the likelihood that they're going to stay increases. When we start to talk about burnout is very real. And as leaders of an organization, one of the things we really need to be mindful of and looking at is our managers. And our managers are those folks burnt out. And understanding what can we do from a mental health perspective, from a physical well-being. I mean, probably a different podcast, but, are we really talking about things like mental health with our team? And caring for those people and providing the kind of services that they may need as caregivers. There's a lot that organizations are going to be looking at in the future as to what are we doing to identify challenges that employees are having, and then what are we doing to improve their overall sense of well-being.
I've heard it said that people don't quit jobs, they quit their managers. And if you've got a management staff or a manager that is burned out or operating in a reactionary mode all the time, you're going to wind up putting a turnstile on the front door of the company, and you're going to keep shuttling people in and out. You've got to make sure that those people at the front end of touching the frontline employees, those managers, are carrying the company flag, are carrying the culture, because that's really where it happens, right? And you can have a culture defined on your brochure, and you can have plaques hanging at the corporate office, but it's really defined when that frontline manager is interacting with the staff, correct?
Absolutely. And so when I speak about the high touch approach and start to work with organizations, one of the questions that I ask is a simple question is, how do you want to show up as a leader? When I start to ask that question and people start to consider themselves, again, thinking about that self-awareness, part of what happens is we start to have a conversation around vulnerability and recognizing that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's actually a strength. For me, it's one of the attributes that I think going forward that a leader can start to work on and becoming more vulnerable themselves with their people, which then creates, the ability for us to connect with other people and our team. And we become and increase the level of engagement with our team members by just being able to have a conversation around asking a simple question, like, how are you doing? How is everything going? And starting to understand like where that person is in their life, so we can start to meet them at that point and figure out what is it that we need to do as an organization to care for our people, again, because our people they're our greatest asset in any organization.
There was a recent study, I think it was Gallup, and it was interesting because they polled employees, frontline employees, as well as managers at the regional corporate level. And it found that the perception of the bosses, of the managers, was that the number one most important thing to employees was pay. But when you look at the results of the employee survey, pay ranked about 5 down the list, with the first being a sense of being included, a sense of belonging, a sense that my boss cares about me. And what's interesting to me is, okay, we have this data, but how many CEOs, how many company presidents are willing to put themselves out there to champion something like this? Because as you said, you almost have to be willing to become vulnerable in order to really demonstrate what the value of something like this.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about is the emotional compensation that's lacking in many organizations. And so it absolutely, when we're talking about engaging with the team and our staff, this does begin in the C-suite. So when I step into an organization and I start talking to a CEO, the buy-in, if you will, is going to happen in the organization if the CEO is actually walking the talk and beginning at that level to also have that greater sense of vulnerability with their team, which again, we talk about self-awareness, and it comes down to the idea of how are you showing up as a leader every day? And if you're showing up, coming from, I like to say, to have that heart-centered approach, people feel that. People feel your energy. And the CEO at the C-suite level, their job is to manage the energy in the organization. So connecting with your people and really understanding what it is that they're looking for to have that greater sense of feeling valued by the organization, valued by their manager, and then being able to create that sense of belonging. That, again, what we're talking about is the disconnect between what the employer is thinking and what the employees are feeling. Connect is part of what's causing the great resignation.
Yeah, I heard that term coined the other day, and I thought that's exactly what we're actually seeing on the front lines in this industry is the great resignation, and how companies are trying to come up with different, people strategies for how do we prevent this from occurring. It's interesting because there's so much what we do in this business, and I'm not every business has got its complexities, but in senior living, senior housing in particular, we're dealing with emotions. We're dealing with people. It's a shame when, as an industry, we don't recognize and help our employees to build those skills that make them more successful. I'm curious, though, have you run into situations where you maybe have someone at the C-suite level that buys into this concept and they're sitting there nodding their head, yeah, this sounds really good, but they themselves aren't really on board, if you know what I mean? They don't want to go out there and lead the charge here. They'll say, yeah, let's send Tom Johnston out to the buildings and let him do his thing. But that they themselves aren't willing to do the same thing for their immediate teams and lead the way.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's where we start to talk about coaching. And when a leader is ready to become vulnerable and start to look at themselves, and then they're able to, begin to walk that talk. One of the things I will say to organizations and leaders is when it comes to doing things like surveys, employee engagement surveys, I will say, hey, don't ask the questions if you're not prepared to take action. That's actually, in some instances, that's worse than not asking at all, because now you've asked my opinion and you're valuing my opinion, but you're not taking action, which, in turn means that you're not necessarily taking action. And so the answer to your question is, yeah, John, I have seen that. I have experienced it. And as a result, I also experience, as me stepping into that organization to support, coach, consult, I start to hear that feedback. And that's where we start to create a different, a greater level of disengagement for the employee. So they can be disengaged with their job, meaning there's a mismatch with the job potentially. They could be disengaged with their manager, their team, or they can also be disengaged, with the culture of the organization. And ultimately, when we talk about, our culture, it's how we behave around here. The leader, the CEO of any organization, people are watching every move that they make and every word that's being said. You're being watched closely every single day. And so if you're walking the talk, wonderful. I applaud that. But if you're not walking the talk and you're saying, hey, do as I say, not as I do, that's not going to help you to retain your team.
Right. Yeah, I had the experience of being at a chief operating level and really championing theories and strategies like this and really saying, hey, we need to listen to our employees. We want to start working on culture. And of course, that's a word for a lot of people that doesn't have a solid return. What's the return on my investment? We're going to spend X amount of time and hours on building culture. And I always bumped into that wall. Well, how much is this going to cost? And what kind of return are we going to get on it? And it's very, fluid, right? So, and I've had that experience where I've been the champion, but when it got up to the CEO level, that's where it stopped. And that individual didn't want to buy in, didn't see the value in it. And as much work as we were doing at our level, anytime that individual walked in to a building, he sent out a different vibe. It felt like it undermined the whole process to some degree.
Yeah, well, the vibe, right, is energy. When that person walks into the building, if again, that their role is to manage the energy in the organization. And if they're sucking the energy out of the people and draining the energy of people, that's going to potentially drive people to the door. And so, when we think about culture, that becomes the DNA of your business. You're either going to attract or you're going to repel people. And when we think about our residents and engaging our residents and the morale of our team, there's an energy there, right? And so that energy is then going to transfer and translate over to our residents and the rest of our team. So, not investing in your culture, if you will, and being intentional about those investments, recognize that if you're not intentional about the culture, that culture is being created around you. And it may not be what you want, what you desire. And that, when we think about your profitability and your revenue growth, there's going to be a direct correlation between your culture and your revenue growth, and whether your bottom line, whatever metrics you're looking to drive from a financial perspective, there's a direct correlation between your level of employee engagement and the profitability of an organization.
Yeah. And you know, what's so interesting is that's a point that I've been advocating for years before we even met. The realization that, look, investing in culture, people say, well, how do you measure it? Well, you can look at your bottom line, look at your NOI. You can look at your resident and family satisfaction survey scores. You can look at your employee engagement scores. You can sense that culture when you walk in a building by the language that you hear being spoken by staff to each other and residents. And it's not nebulous. It's very concrete. And it does have measurable outcomes. In that way, you can see the value of investing in culture. So if I'm a leader and let's say I'm an executive director at a building or regional or even at the VP level or whatever, and I want to affect the culture, and what can I do? I mean, what do I need in order to improve the culture in my building?
There's a couple of things that you can do. One is, begin to survey your team. And begin to understand, as you pointed out, John, start to measure your employee net promoter score. I view the employee net promoter score as a measurement of your culture, and begin to benchmark that score. And then as we start to identify other areas of improvement, we start to take action on those specifics and create that action plan, and we execute, and we tell we become, again, vulnerable. And we start to share those results with the organization and then tell folks, what are we going to do to improve the work conditions and improve the work environment? So that's one thing that we can do. And it's pretty simple. And then, the other thing is, from a leadership perspective, if you're at the VP level and you're not connecting with your directors and your direct reports on a regular basis, I will talk about things like one-on-ones. And are you actually having one-on-one meetings on a regular basis, a consistent basis, so you're providing an opportunity to have a two-way conversation, right? And that conversation isn't necessarily always just about your tasks and here's what needs to be accomplished and, how are we doing in terms of performing against OKRs, et cetera. It's about making that connection with the individual and understanding on a very, very, human level, if you will, how are you doing? Providing time to people is oftentimes something that's very, very simple to do. And it's like, slow down, pause, and let's just connect. Let's have a cup of coffee together, whether it's in person or virtual.
Right. Yeah. And nowadays, virtual is almost as good. Tom, you had mentioned something to me just before we started the podcast about a peer advisory group that you've been putting together. I'm curious what that looks like and who is that meant for? How does that work into what you do?
Well, I had the good fortune of, I had a mentor back when I was operating health and fitness clubs. I had a mentor who, as soon as I went to work for this organization, they provided an opportunity for me to be involved in an industry roundtable group. I had the good fortune of being involved in that group for 11 years. It was a group of folks that would come together a few times a year, and we would do that in person. And it was invaluable to me in terms of a learning experience, as well as the relationships that I've made over the years, and I've maintained those relationships. And so what I'm doing is I've created peer advisory groups that we meet once a month, and we meet virtually. And it's the opportunity for leaders. And when we think about, who's it targeted for, it's really those individuals that are sitting in the C-suite that are looking for answers, that are going to be able to come together with their peers and share their challenges and be able to create a community where we're going to come together and we're going to help each other. We're going to learn and we're going to grow together, and we're going to support each other in a virtual environment. So, from a time perspective, we meet once a month for 3 hours at a time. My objective is to help those leaders become the best version of themselves, where they're going to also get vulnerable with their peers. We're going to be able to provide constructive feedback for leaders that, frankly, they may not hear anywhere else. And so when you start to open yourself up in that environment, what I personally experienced and what I witnessed over time was there was a tremendous amount of growth that happened there.
The concept is fantastic. And I think, especially when you're with like-minded individuals, sharing challenges in a judgment-free setting, and nothing but good brainstorming typically comes from that. And just the ability to share the challenges and listen to how other folks are dealing with it. It sounds super helpful and very timely right now with everything that's going on. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions just because I'm goofy and I like to do these kinds of things. But what makes you motivated? You get up in the morning and you're getting ready to go out there and tackle the day and you've got X, Y, and Z to do. Well, what gets you out of bed? What gets you motivated?
Well, what gets me out of bed? I'm an early riser. I love to start my day with meditation and prayer. So I'll spend anywhere from half hour to an hour just getting quiet. I've found that followed by a yoga class is a wonderful way for me to start my day. What motivates me and what gets me excited is working with organizations that truly want to make the kind of changes that are needed today to help people come into an organization, join an organization, and prosper and grow. I couldn't be any more excited about what I do every day and witnessing the changes in people as they start to adopt the tools that we're talking about and they start to look at themselves and they actually do the work with coaching and we start to see the changes. That is the most rewarding part of my job every single day.
Harken back to a conversation you and I had, which is not that long ago. And I was telling you that the impact I was experiencing as a result of your coaching and having gone through some of the analytics on myself were profound. And they had resulted in changes in my behavior that I recognize, hey, I've got an opportunity to grow here. I can see where that would provide you with gratification and a sense of accomplishment. Because even in my life, you had a profound impact through your coaching and my ability to share with you in a judgment-free environment. And I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to take a minute to thank you for that.
Well, you're quite welcome. And that's just makes me feel fantastic. So thank you for that. That's a great boost to my energy, John. Thank you.
Hey, okay. Let me ask you a last question here before we kind of let people know how to get in touch with you. Give me one career experience you weren't expecting, something that came out of the blue to you.
Oh, so back in 2008, I was involved in an attempted acquisition of a fitness club. And of course, we had this little problem with our economy. I was fortunate enough to be able to look for a job and actually at that time find a job. And I was introduced to a guy by the name of Steve Cass, who was the founder of a company called American Leisure. And I had stepped away from the fitness industry, if you will, running clubs as it was. And I started working in the real estate service business. We were designing and operating amenity spaces in residential buildings. And we got a call one day. I was with the company maybe 6 months, and the call came from somebody in Saudi Arabia. They expressed interest in our services to help them open up a university in Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah University of Science and Technology.
Wow.
And I had the good fortune of being the point person on that project and was involved in opening the first co-ed, first international university in Saudi Arabia. And I was responsible for creating the fitness and the lifestyle programming and ultimately building the community and connecting people. That was a once in a lifetime experience that I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity.
That is amazing. Hey, how was the food in Saudi Arabia?
The food was great, actually. So Mediterranean food has now become my favorite food as a result of that experience.
Very cool.
It was pretty darn good.
Fair enough. Hey, Tom, if people want to learn more about you or Talent Optimizer Group or the peer advisory groups, how can they find out more?
It's pretty simple. It's tom@talentoptimizergroup.com. You can also find me on my website. It's talentoptimizergroup.com, and you can schedule a conversation there. So I'm happy to chat with folks and share more with them about talent optimization and peer advisory groups, and also perhaps how I can help from a coaching perspective.
Perfect. Tom, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, and happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks, Tom.